Hello everyone, this is Dr. Hassanat, Associate Professor of Physiology from Kaji Medical College. I'm back with a new video on respiratory system. Today, my lecture topic will be about pulmonary circulation and the respiratory membrane. So let's have a look on the screen. What is pulmonary circulation? Pulmonary circulation is the circulation between right ventricle and left atrium. And the very basic functions of pulmonary circulations are carries of blood from right to left side of the heart. At the same time, there will be exchange of gases between the blood and the alveolar air. And the venous blood become oxygenated and some carbon dioxide is removed from the circulation. Pulmonary circulation acts as a blood reservoir as they are highly compliant than the other systemic vasculature. Okay, the pulmonary circulation is shorter than the systemic circulation as the pulmonary circulation time is about only 5 seconds. Now I'm going to tell you some very special physiological features of pulmonary circulations. Okay, most of the characteristics they're quite different from the characteristics of the systemic circulations. So I am going to point out those features that are different from the systemic circulation. Here you can see the pulmonary circulation is a low pressure system, whereas the systemic circulation is a high pressure system. In the systemic circulation, the mean arterial pressure is maintained around 100 millimeter of mercury. And for more accurately, it is 93 to 95 millimeter of mercury in case of systemic circulation. But you can see here the mean pressure in the pulmonary, mean pulmonary arterial pressure is only 15 millimeter of mercury. Okay, so this is very low. Also, the pulmonary capillary pressure is low as well. That is about only 7 to 8 millimeter of mercury. As this pulmonary capillary, this is the largest capillary bed in the body. Okay. At the same time, this pulmonary vasculature produce very low resistance. Okay. Whereas the systemic in the systemic circulation, the resistance is higher. Here, this pulmonary vasculature that produce only 1/10 of the resistance of the systemic circulations. So why the resistance is very low here? Because the arterioles of pulmonary circulation have less smooth muscle on their wall. And also the pulmonary vessels are thin, short, and wide. So that is why the resistance is very low. The next point is pulmonary circulation. It is highly compliant. They're highly compliant and higher capacitance as well. There is approximately 490 ml or almost 500 ml of blood present in the pulmonary circulation at any given time. Okay, so as they are more compliant, they can accommodate more blood without any significant change in the pulmonary arterial pressure. So that is why we have considered this circulation as a high compliance. And another thing that this circulation can accommodate shifts of blood more quickly when a person shifts up from a standing to a lying position. So when a person during standing positions, the bloods are pulled to the periphery. So the blood volume in the pulmonary circulation reduced. But when the posture is suddenly changed, a person changes his posture suddenly from standing to a lying position. So what will happen? From the periphery, again, the blood that will be pulled or venous return increases. So finally, it will increase the volume of blood in the pulmonary circulation. And pulmonary circulation can accommodate this extra amount of blood very quickly during the change of posture. as their compliance is high. Okay. Now, you know, the pulmonary circulation, the blood flow is very high. That is equal to cardiac output. So every time the right ventricle pumps blood to the pulmonary circulation, and it is every minute, the amount of blood that is pumped into the pulmonary circulation, that is 5 liters. So that is equal to cardiac output. So as the resistance is very low, the pressure is very low, and they are highly compliant, they can accommodate this very high blood flow. Is it okay? Now, another important things for specialty of the pulmonary circulation, that distribution of pulmonary blood flow throughout the lung is not uniform or not equal or not even. The distribution is uneven or unequal. Okay. In upright posture, blood flow increases from apex to the base of the lung. That means the lowest blood flow at the apex and the highest blood flow at the base. And this variation occurs due to the effect of gravity. Okay. You can see here is the lung, and we can divide the lung in 3 zones. The most uppermost portion, that is the apex, this is called the zone 1 or zones of no blood flow, and the middle portion, this is called zone 2 or zone of intermittent blood flow, and the base or lowermost portion, that is called zone 3 or this is the zone of continuous blood flow. Now, if you observe carefully, you can see here that in the apical region, the effects of gravity is that is higher than any other zones of the lung. So due to this reason, in the apical region, the pulmonary capillary or alveolar capillary pressure is remain lower than the alveolar air pressure during the whole period of cardiac cycle. So what will happen? This, as the pulmonary capillary pressure remain lower than the alveolar air pressure, so this capillary will be compressed by the alveolar air pressures. So in this region, there will be no blood flow. Okay. Now, what will happen in the middle portion of the lung or zone 2? In the zone 2, as this effects of gravity decreases in comparison to the apical region, so during the systolic contraction of the heart, this capillary pressure become higher than the alveolar air pressure. So at that moment, this capillary will be opened up and allow the flow of blood. But when there is a diastole, again this capillary pressure drops below the or become less than the alveolar air pressure. So during diastole, this capillary again they will be compressed by the air pressure and there will be no blood flow. That means in this middle portion of the lung, during systole, there will be blood flow, but in the diastole, the blood flow will be stopped. So this is the zone of intermittent blood flow. And now the zone 3, it is the lowermost portion or the basal portion. At this region, the effects of gravity is minimum, or it's remain almost at the level of the heart. So all the time during systole or diastole, this capillary pressure remain higher than the alveolar air pressure. So all the time during the whole period of cardiac cycle, this capillary will remain open and that will allow continuous blood flow. Okay, so this is called zone 3 or zones of continuous blood flow. So basically there are 3 zones: the apical region, it is zone 1 or zone of no blood flow; the middle portion, it is called zone of intermittent blood flow or zone 2, and the lowermost portion, it is called zone 3 or zones of continuous blood flow. Interesting thing I want to mention, during exercise, you know the cardiac output increases. So due to this increased cardiac output, the blood flow to the pulmonary circulation also increases, and that will increase the pulmonary capillary pressure. So during exercise, in this apical region, some of the collapsed or closed capillaries, they will open up due to increased cardiac output. That will increase the capillary pressure. So that is why during exercise, as the new capillaries, they will open up. This is called recruitment of the capillaries, and that will increase or that will improve the perfusion to that region, and they will take part in the gaseous sections, and that will increase the diffusion surface area and thereby increase the diffusion. Okay. Now, another important special features that lungs have dual circulations, and there is a very important features that is called venous admixture. So dual circulation, that means lung gets nutrition from two types of circulation, that is bronchial circulation, and via bronchial vein, some amount of deoxygenated blood, that is say it is 2% of the cardiac output, that drain into the left atrium. And you know the left atrium that actually contain oxygenated blood. So this 2% of the deoxygenated blood that coming through the bronchial circulation, and finally they join or mix up with the oxygenated blood at the left atrium. Okay, and that will reduce the partial pressure of oxygen in the systemic circulations. Another things, we know during the there will be gaseous sections between the pulmonary capillaries and the alveolar air, but not all the blood that passes through the pulmonary circulation is oxygenated. Some amount of blood passing through the pulmonary circulation do not get oxygenated due to ventilation perfusion mismatch. That means some amount of blood they're passing through the pulmonary circulation, but they do not get oxygenated. So what will happen? The same thing happens, that this some amount of deoxygenated blood that transmitted from right side to left side of the heart and finally mix up with the oxygenated blood at the left atrium, that will further reduce the partial pressure of oxygen in the systemic circulation. Okay. So this amount of blood, this is called shunted blood or right to left shunt or venous admixture. So admixture of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. So this is the two important factors that contribute to development of this physiological shunt. So this is normally present in case of healthy individual. This is not pathological. Okay. So this whole concept is known as venous admixture or physiological shunt. Okay. But I will give another lecture on physiological shunt. But just for now, you should remember this is the special or peculiar characteristics of pulmonary circulations. Okay. Now, the next point, you know, in the systemic circulation, the arterial system contains oxygenated blood and the venous system contains deoxygenated blood. But here in the pulmonary circulation, you will observe that artery carries deoxygenated blood and the pulmonary vein carry oxygenated blood. And the very, very important peculiarities of pulmonary circulation, that is the hypoxic vasoconstriction. You know, normally in case of systemic circulation, hypoxia or raised carbon dioxide concentration, that will cause vasodilatation in the systemic circulation. But the effect is completely different here in the pulmonary circulation. That will cause vasoconstriction. This is called hypoxic vasoconstriction. The actual mechanism is the arterioles of the pulmonary circulations, the arteriolar smooth muscle, they contain some hypoxia sensitive potassium channel. So during the hypoxia, this hypoxia sensitive potassium channel become closed. So what will happen? That will prevent the efflux of potassium. Results depolarization of the cell, and that will allow the opening of the calcium channel, and due to the entry of calcium into the cell, this calcium causes the contraction of the smooth muscle and thereby causes vasoconstriction. So that is the mechanism, and that is completely different from the systemic circulation. Okay, so it is very important. The local effects of low partial pressure of oxygen or high carbon dioxide on pulmonary vessel, the effect is vasoconstriction. And another important features of pulmonary circulation is automatic control system for distributing blood flow to the pulmonary areas in proportion to their degree of ventilation. So what does it mean? Now it will be easy for you to understand. If you understand the hypoxic vasoconstriction, then it will be easy for you. Suppose there are, the 300 millions of alveoli are there. Say some of these alveoli gets less ventilation. So the ventilation is less. So what will happen? That as the oxygen concentration or partial pressure of oxygen in the alveolar air goes down, that will causes vasoconstriction of those alveolar capillary. So this vasoconstriction of poorly ventilated alveolar capillary will redirect the blood to the well ventilated alveolar capillary. Is it clear? So blood flow will be shifted from poorly ventilated alveoli to the well ventilated alveoli. This is called automatic control system for distributing blood flow to the pulmonary area in proportion to their degree of ventilation. Okay. Now, the last important features or peculiar features of pulmonary circulation, I want to mention it serves as a filter. So what does it filter? Actually, these endothelial cells of pulmonary vessels release fibrinolytic agent that lyse the blood clots or unwanted emboli, and thus prevent them from reaching and blocking the vessels in the brain and heart. So this pulmonary circulation, they are very much efficient with this property, this fibrinolytic property, and thereby they prevent or they can filter the unwanted clot or micro emboli or thrombi from the circulation, and thereby prevent the blocking the vessels in the brain and heart. So this is very important. So these are the most important peculiar features of the pulmonary circulation. Now I'm going to tell you something about the respiratory membrane. Respiratory membrane, or simply it is called blood-gas interface. So this interface basically separates the blood in the pulmonary capillaries from the gas in the alveoli. Okay. So here is the definition. You can write it down, but the basic thing I have already told you, this is the membrane that separates the blood in the pulmonary capillary from the gas in the alveoli. Okay. And this membrane is very thin. The thickness is about 0.2 to 0.6 micrometer, whereas the total surface area is very large. That is about 70 square meter. Okay. Now, what are the layers of respiratory membrane? So you can, if you look at this figure, the two important structures that is involved in the formation of respiratory membrane, that is alveolar wall and the capillary wall. Okay. Here you can see the first layer that lies between the air, okay, and the alveolar epithelium, this is the fluid layer, the fluid that lines the alveoli. That this layer also contains surfactant. Okay, and the next layer, that is called the alveolar epithelium. Here you can see this is the epithelial cells, and this is actually simple squamous epithelium or type 1 cells. The next layer is the basement membrane of the alveolar epithelium. Then there is a very thin interstitial space between the alveolar epithelial basement membrane and the basement membrane of capillary endothelium. This is called interstitium. It's a very thin. Okay. And followed by the next layer, that is the basement membrane of the capillary endothelium, and finally the endothelial lining. So there are actually 6 layers of the respiratory membrane. So note the following different layer of the respiratory membrane I have already shown you. There is the first layer, that is a layer of fluid lining the alveolus and containing surfactant that reduce the surface tension of the alveolar fluid. Second layer is the alveolar epithelium. Third layer is alveolar epithelial basement membrane. The fourth layer, a thin interstitial space between the alveolar epithelium and the capillary membrane. And the fifth layer is a capillary basement membrane. And finally, the capillary endothelium. Okay. Now, actually, what is the basic function of this respiratory membrane? The main function of this membrane is to allow the gaseous exchange between the alveolar air and the pulmonary blood. So there are different factors that actually determine how rapidly a gas will pass through the membrane, or what are the factors that affect the gas diffusion or affect the rate of gas diffusion through this membrane. Okay. Number one, you know the thickness, this membrane is very thin and the thickness is only about 0.2 to 0.6 micrometer. So if there is any increase the thickness of this membrane, that will reduce the rate of diffusion. So the first factor that is very important, the thickness of the membrane and the rate of diffusion is inversely proportional to the thickness of the membrane. Here you can see some pathological condition where this thickness may be increased, like in there as it is seen in diffuse interstitial fibrosis, asbestosis. So simply simply in case of pulmonary edema, this accumulation of the fluid either in this interstitial space or within the alveoli, that will increase the thickness of the respiratory membrane, and that will reduce the gas diffusion. Okay. Number two, the surface area of the membrane. This is so simple. If the diffusion surface area increases, diffusion will be increased. So the relationship is proportional. The diffusion is directly proportional to the surface area. Diffusion decreases in condition like emphysema and increases in condition in which there is a more opening of number of capillaries as occurring exercise. That means in case of exercise, this diffusion surface area increases. Okay, I have already explained that during exercise, some of the capillary in the apical region that remain collapsed in normal resting condition, but during exercise, when the cardiac output increases, and that will increase the capillary pressures, and when this capillary pressure becomes higher than the alveolar air pressure, this capillary will be open and allow the or establish the perfusion, and that will increase the surface area of the membrane. Okay, so thereby will increase the diffusion, but there are some certain pathological conditions like the emphysema, where there will be damage in the alveolar wall. So that will reduce the diffusion surface area and results in the decreased rate of diffusion, and the patient will suffer from hypoxia. Now, third factors that is very important for the simple diffusion, that is the partial pressure difference of gas on both sides of the membrane. Okay, so the diffusion of gases depends on difference of partial pressure of individual gas across the membrane. Greater the partial pressure gradient, greater will be the rate of diffusion. Okay. Now, the fourth factor, that is called diffusion coefficient. So what is diffusion coefficient? Actually, diffusion coefficient of a gas is directly proportional to its solubility and inversely proportional to the square root of its molecular weight. That means diffusion coefficient depends on two important factors. Number one, the solubility of the gas. If the gas is more the lipid soluble, more will be the diffusion coefficient, more will be the rate of diffusions. But it is inversely proportional to the square root of molecular weight. That means if the molecular weight become larger, that will decrease the diffusion coefficient and finally decrease the rate of diffusions. Okay. And here you can observe that carbon dioxide diffuse about 20 times as rapidly as oxygen. That means the diffusion coefficient of carbon dioxide is higher, 20 times higher than the oxygen. And oxygen diffuse about twice as rapidly as nitrogen. That means diffusion coefficient of oxygen is higher than the nitrogen. Okay. And it is this property basically depends on lipid solubility and the molecular size. Now, what is diffusion capacity? Diffusion capacity is actually defined as how much volume of a particular type of gas that will diffuse through the membrane in 1 minute when there is a partial pressure difference of 1 millimeter of mercury. Okay. Suppose in the resting condition, the diffusion capacity of oxygen, that is 21 ml per minute per millimeter of mercury pressure difference. So what does it mean? It means that when there is a partial pressure difference of oxygen across the membrane is 1 millimeter of mercury, that will allow the diffusion of 21 ml of oxygen in 1 minute. Okay. Similarly, the diffusion capacity of carbon dioxide, it is 400 to 450 ml per minute per millimeter of mercury. So that means when there is a partial pressure difference of carbon dioxide across the membrane is 1 millimeter of mercury, that will allow diffusion of 400 ml of carbon dioxide in 1 minute in the resting condition. That means the diffusion capacity is 20 times higher than the diffusion capacity of oxygen. Okay. And during exercise, this diffusion capacity will be increased by 3 times than the normal resting condition. Say if the resting in the resting condition, the diffusion capacity of oxygen is 21, but during exercise it will increase by 65 ml per minute per millimeter of mercury. That means that it is increased almost 3 times. Okay. Similarly, carbon dioxide during exercise diffusion capacity will be increased, and during exercise it is 1200 to 1300 milliliter per minute per millimeter of mercury pressure difference. Is it clear? So now here I have shown an equation. This DC means diffusion capacity, that is proportional to this PG means actually partial pressure gradient. So it is proportional to the pressure gradient. That means if the pressure gradient is more, diffusion capacity will be more. Then S for solubility. If the gas is more lipid soluble, the diffusion capacity will be more. And A for surface area of the respiratory membrane. If the surface area increases, diffusion capacity also increases. So these are there is a proportional relationship. Okay. But the diffusion capacity is inversely related to the square root of molecular weight. That means if the molecular weight increases, diffusion capacity will be decreases. Okay, and D for thickness of the membrane. So in case of increased thickness, the diffusion capacity, it will be decreased. So these two factors actually inverse, there is an inverse relationship between the diffusion capacity and the molecular weight and the thickness of the membrane. So thank you so much. That's all for today.